Until 2 seconds ago, I didn't feel at home, but now I do. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, James. Thank you all for being here, giving generously of your time. I appreciate it very much. I'm delighted to be back in Australia. I'm especially delighted, honored in fact, to be with the great folks from the IPA. I hope you guys realize how well regarded and well respected your work is and how it resonates far beyond these shores. And so those of you who give your support year in, year out, I encourage you to continue to do so, because the IPA is making a difference, not just in Australia, but in other parts of the world as well. James's introduction, he touched on the fact that I used to focus, I started out in the think tank world focusing exclusively on fun. I've gotten back to the fun or the vice. Sometimes I'm introduced, depending on the group and the person doing the introducing, as the king of vice or pro-vice or something like that. You can imagine how proud it makes my mother every time she hears that. But it reminds me of, I think this happened about around the time I was last here, in 2011. I'd been in Las Vegas for a very extended period researching the gambling book that James kindly referred to. And the day I was leaving, Las Vegas suffered a blizzard, which in characteristic American understatement was referred to on the front of the Vegas newspaper the next day as Snowmageddon. And so myself and many other people were at the airport unable to get away. So we're sent back into the city, and enormous queue for cabs and all that kind of thing. I finally get in a cab, and the gentleman who gets in the cab with me, this older gentleman, was sharing this ride in, and turns out he's a reporter for the local paper based in Washington, like me trying to get back to Washington. And he asked me what I'm doing, and I said, well, I've been here researching this book on gambling. And he asked me where I've been and what casinos and this, that, and the other. And he said, have you been to Searchlight? And I was thinking to myself, I don't remember Searchlight. Is that a rat packy thing, or what is that about? It turns out he's from Searchlight. Searchlight is a small town outside of Las Vegas. And I said, he said, really, you really should think about it. And I said, well, what's your thing? What's your value added, as the economists say? And he said, well, Searchlight has the highest ratio of brothels in the state of Nevada. And I said, okay, well, everyone, good for you, I guess. And I said, well, has there ever been an issue? He said, how many did you say you had? He said, well, you got 13. We got 13. It's a small town. I said, has there ever been an issue for you? He said, well, actually, a few years ago it was. You see, we have a rule. We don't have many rules, clearly, in Searchlight. But we have one rule, which is that no brothel can come within a certain distance of our one school. 13 brothels, one school in the town of Searchlight. And a few years back, it was determined that one of the brothels was within the acceptable space. So we had to figure out what to do. And I said, well, I'm considered a rabid libertarian, but, I appreciate the concerns at play here. Were you able to figure it out? And he said, oh, yeah. The council met, and they came up with a solution. I said, well, what was that? They moved the school. Which is a way of saying, be wary of who you share a cab with in Las Vegas, but it's also a way of saying that I think sometimes we need to recognize that there's a need to think a little differently about how we regulate our personal and private and individual behaviors. I think I might be, perhaps, the first person to begin an IPA-hosted talk with a quotation from Marx. Not Karl, but Groucho. Groucho said, politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. Now, throughout the Western world, politicians are dedicated to proving Groucho right. In that vein, they seem incapable of resisting the nannying impulse. On my flight a couple of days ago from Los Angeles to Sydney, I watched a film starring Meryl Streep and Jeff Bridges called The Giver. Now, this film centers on a seemingly ideal world of conformity. It's actually a cautionary tale of a total ban on risk, pain, and personal choice. I mean, basically, The film portrays the nanny state fantasy of the global public health establishment, who, on most days, appear consumed by their fear that someone, somewhere, may actually be happy. Health ministers are afflicted with what I call Mary Poppins syndrome. None will ever rest until we're all practically perfect in every way. And the farther one reaches down the socioeconomic ladder, the more perfecting there's to be performed by those who know more than we do ourselves about what's good and bad for us. To summarize the nanny state in a few words, I describe it as a conspiracy of good taste. The nanny state's really a good old-fashioned, if undeclared, class war, tarted up with scientific and public health trappings. The object of the nanny state's ire is the stereotypical average Joe, an overweight, working-class male addicted to junk food and sports betting, at least when he's not swilling pints and smoking cigarettes while lying couch potato mode. Behaviors he, of course, learned from watching TV adverts. The nanny state also lacks sympathy for average Jane's addiction to her fake tan. Today's political establishment is inculcated with a spirit of 21st century style noblesse oblige that views the public health arena as ground zero for improving the lot of those born into challenging circumstances. The poor and the working class are the subjects of a real-time social science experiment designed by their social betters for the purpose of changing and therefore improving their diets, habits, preferences, pleasures, and leisure and recreation pursuits. This is the driving force behind the elite's attack on inappropriate eating, drinking, smoking, gambling, and tanning. For the elite, these activities are inappropriate because they are unacceptable risks to health or healthy living. And the risk can be infinitesimal and still be unacceptable. Last year, the American government published detailed instructions on how to roast marshmallows without setting yourself on fire. At its core, the nanny state asserts individual liberty isn't the central value of democratic societies, since considerations of health and collective welfare must take precedence over it. In matters relating to health, individuals are often uninformed or irrational in their choices, fail to understand their own interests, and don't know best how to realize those interests. The nanny state seeks to restrict the rights of competent adults in order to protect them from the allegedly harmful consequences of their own insufficiently considered actions. See, don't you see, when people have the freedom to choose, they choose wrong. Consequently, the government needs to legislate good health choices. The most potent expression in the vocabulary of the nanny state, indeed its definitive expression, is it's for your own good. The nanny state's conception of health and the value of health replaces not only the values of the individual, but also the individual's weighing of risk and reward, a not insubstantial trespass on individual liberty. My objections to the nanny state are therefore both moral and empirical. In my view, the nanny state has no place in a democracy in that it collides with the fundamental right of individual liberty. Second, the nanny state's claims about lifestyle and disease, both in terms of causes and cures, are scientifically unfounded. In fact, the nanny state is both undemocratic and unscientific. The most significant moral problem is its enormous erosion of individual liberty through systematically employing the engine of the state, particularly propaganda and regulation, to define and to enforce a single vision of what constitutes a good life. At its heart, the nanny state is committed not to abolishing popular pleasures in one grand gesture. That would be too obvious, too crude, and arouse too much passionate opposition, but instead to using the mechanisms of social engineering to ease it gradually out of existence. The key to the project is the sweeping definition of health a definition that's simultaneously broad and narrow, which allows it a truly totalitarian compass of control over individuals by prescribing precisely what's acceptable behavior. Health becomes the authority against which pleasure becomes permissible. By the narrow sense of health, I mean the nanny state thinks of health largely in terms of longevity. In this sense, most of the traditional pleasures are classed as enemies of longevity. But at the same time, the nanny state also embraces a wide sense of health that attempts to bring every aspect of life within the purview of health. Once health is defined in this fashion, it brings quite literally everything, character, beliefs, habit, culture, and pleasure, within the purview of the state. Consequently, reasoned and careful argument becomes unnecessary. It's sufficient to simply utter the dreaded U word, unhealthy, and pleasures of whatever pedigree are doomed. This is rightly described as totalitarian in the sense that the project is all-embracing. To save the body, we quite literally must re-engineer the soul. This health project, this truly radical commitment to social engineering, is fundamentally at odds with individual liberty. At the core of a democratic society lies considerable unease with the idea that the government has a role in structuring the citizen's soul and life through telling him what to think, believe, and be, through directing him in his likes and dislikes, structuring his pleasures, and passing judgment on what he might choose to eat and drink. There are other values that are equally important to a full and a good life. The new religion of health dictates that we submit to any regimen, surrender virtually any pleasure, compromise any liberty, so long as it allegedly gains us a deferral of death. These days, most of the momentum for the nanny state comes from people who consider popular culture distasteful, ugly, and immoral. The metropolitan elite's mores are the catalyst for an attempt to alter the common features of ordinary life. Stripped to its essential character, the nanny state is a war on what the public health establishment and the political elite consider illegitimate pleasure. In his book, Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu writes that tastes are perhaps first and foremost distastes, disgust provoked by horror or visceral intolerance of the tastes of others, especially those inferior to you. Contemporary elites are fixated upon their moral and physical lessers because they view bad habits and immoral behavior as signs of national failure, and that national failure is their responsibility to diagnose and eradicate. Today, health promotion has replaced religious salvation as the highest value to which a sophisticated person may aspire. A proposal to ban or impose a tax on certain books, plays, or ideas in order to change people's behavior and improve their mental health wouldn't survive a moment of serious consideration. Yet the same policy applied to allegedly unhealthy behavior appears to be uncontroversial, precisely because it's only about health. But diminishing individual liberty under the guise of health is still diminishing individual liberty, and as such is still unacceptable. The case for the nanny state is portrayed as a necessary component of making people healthier, and the support for this is supposedly provided by science. I say supposedly, since there are two sorts of problems with the claim that the nanny state is scientific. The first problem is that the general claim that health promotion is based on science is simply not true. It's all really quite Orwellian. The public health truth, capital T, is actually a lie. Consider the paradigmatic argument of the nanny state that some pleasure, say eating large amounts of so-called junk food, is wrong. The nanny state says to average Joe on his couch, it's a scientific fact that if you stop eating so much junk food, you'll live longer. Therefore, you should stop eating so much junk food. This syllogism is, however, incomplete, and the advice is flawed. The nanny state actually requires an additional premise, such as Joe values living longer more than he enjoys eating so much junk food. So the argument is now, it's a scientific fact that if you stop eating so much junk food, you'll live longer. Since you value living longer more than you value eating so much junk food, you should stop eating so much junk food. But as soon as this premise is added, the supposed scientific character of the nanny state is exposed for what it is, a thin cheat. Although it might well be science that tells Joe he'll live longer if he eats less junk food, it's not science that tells Joe that he ought to value living longer more than he values eating his junk food. The oughts that the nanny state directs to Joe aren't scientific oughts, but moral oughts, or more particularly the nanny state's elitist moral oughts. Science doesn't provide us with oughts about culture and pleasure, even if it can provide us with facts about pleasure. This doesn't mean that the nanny state's admonitions are unworthy of Joe's attention. It's merely to suggest they're not the pronouncements of science. They have to be justified, like every other bit of moral philosophy, through careful argument and not by dogmatic pronouncement. But this is precisely what the nanny state refuses to do. Instead of admitting that it's providing value-laden advice, it attempts to characterize its advice as scientific and therefore unquestionable. In effect, the scientific character of the nanny state extends at best to its claims to knowledge about the causes of disease. Its claims about what to do with this knowledge form no part of science. Indeed, these are as much a part of the arena of personal beliefs and values as are politics and religion. The importance of this to the nanny state's elitist attempt to trounce popular pleasures is enormous. The nanny state's admonitions about pleasure, its pleasure agenda, if you will, are built on a very shaky conceptual foundation that has never done the difficult work of providing itself with a compelling moral foundation for why a life of, say, 70 years, full of self-chosen pleasures, is in some sense inferior to a life of 75 years that has been deprived of many of those pleasures. But this is precisely the kind of argument about the value of pleasure that the nanny stater must make. I'm not suggesting to you that 70 years crammed with pleasures, those frowned upon by the nanny state, are necessarily better than 75 abstemious years. Indeed, these are precisely the sorts of choices that are best made by individuals. We have the right to make what other people may deem to be bad choices. But this doesn't relieve the nanny state of the obligation of providing us with compelling reasons why longevity is to be preferred to pleasure. There's a second problem with nanny state science. While the guardians of the nanny state are entitled to their own opinion on the best way to improve public health, they aren't entitled to their own evidence. Much nanny state science is, in fact, highly questionable as science and fails to meet the standards of evidence-based medicine. A political elite looking beyond moralistic judgments on behavior to actual solutions would do better to analyze the culture of government dependency created by the welfare state, which has weakened traditional systems of mutual support and depleted stores of self-reliance. Is there any reason for optimism? I take a modicum of comfort and draw a measure of hope from the ordinary person's apparently budding social libertarianism. The war on popular pleasures must be a covert slice-by-slice war, strategic incrementalism, if you will, because already there are documented examples of popular intransigence in the face of irrational public health policy. Take, for example, participation in the illicit tobacco market by smokers in socially deprived areas. Far from being ashamed of such behavior, these low-income smokers see it as a way of challenging an unjust tax directed very much at them. As more people appreciate that freedom implies some leeway for personal risk and pleasurable foolishness, public health issues have the potential to matter in future elections because of the growth in the average Westerner's unwillingness to be bullied out of and into particular habits. There's a growing awareness, a fear even, that soon we'll be living nothing more than a life of shadows, a life of echoes, a life of faint, distant whispers of what once made us real. In regulatory terms, the nanny state has compounded its original error by turning the food industry, into the new tobacco. Today's anti-big food policy menu is a recipe for failure. Even if one were to suspend reality and accept the notion of an actual obesity epidemic, caused, of course, by the free market, the conventional prescriptions for fitter, thinner citizens will be unsuccessful for the same reason that tobacco plain packaging is a failure. The record of the nanny state is clear. It is not very good at changing personal health conduct. All these food and tobacco policies are doomed by the absence of an evidentiary basis to suggest that they are either necessary or indeed helpful. One school of thought holds that an optimist is someone who simply has not heard the news yet. By that definition, the anti-tobacco lobby is an optimist about plain packaging. I think it worth reminding proponents of this policy that a person trying to change the world fails for one simple and unavoidable reason: everyone else. And for the fact that such regulations have terrible unintended consequences. Historian Christopher Clark called the political leaders of a century ago sleepwalkers for their inability to appreciate the larger systemic consequences of their individual actions. Today's sleepwalking public health policymakers don't, or perhaps the word is won't, recognize the consequences, illicit trade, of their actions, rising tobacco taxes and plain packaging. Those of us against plain packaging and comparable nanny state mistakes possess a singular advantage over the public health establishment. We have truth, that is evidence, on our side. But in today's illiberal climate, I'm thinking of the applicability of George Orwell's observation that there are times when telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. So the nanny staters' fundamental problem is that they are wrong. Yet even though further tobacco, food, alcohol, and gambling regulation isn't necessary, guess what? It's coming our way, unless more is done to stop it. Both industries and consumers hurt by the nanny state should reflect, I suggest to you, upon General Douglas MacArthur's maxim that all military disasters can be explained by two words: too late. Is it too late to defeat the nanny state? Well, here are two ideas for beating it back. First, know your enemy. Today's nanny staters are unapologetically autocratic. President Obama's first-term regulatory czar, Cass Sunstein, or other radical thinkers proudly proclaiming the nanny state is really, really good for you. It's critical to appreciate that they are extremists. They are extremists who don't seek the end of the Happy Meal as an end in and of itself. Rather, they seek the end of McDonald's as a legal company. They don't seek to stop casino expansion. They seek an end to legal gambling. Their goal isn't a plain cigarette pack. Their goal is the collapse of the tobacco industry. And they're getting bolder every day. The British Medical Association is currently lobbying David Cameron's allegedly conservative government to make smoking illegal for anyone born in this century. It's a creeping sort of persecution, an epic intolerance, a determination to do away with particular pleasures based on tendentious or simply spurious health advice. They use various techniques to advance their narrative. These include the repetition of propaganda, ignoring evidence that contradicts their own biases and prejudice. They cannot themselves be reasoned with or persuaded. Knowing their weaknesses, however, allows them to be used as props, enabling counter-arguments to be more effectively constructed and delivered. The Nanny State's leading lights are devout disciples of the most Machiavellian political strategists. Nanny Staters are, almost to a man and woman, addicted to the political genius of a gentleman by the name of Saul Alinsky, an inspiration to Barack Obama and other socialists. A generation ago, Alinsky wrote a classic how-to guide for extremists on obtaining political influence and power, entitled Rules for Radicals. Alinsky's main rule was simply this: above all, diminish, demean, and denormalize your opposition. Alinsky stressed that the merits of any debate are irrelevant because the other side's views are simply inherently always wrong. That's why, if one presents the Nanny State lobby with an empirical point-by-point rebuttal of one of their regulatory proposals, they literally and figuratively turn away, as if neither you nor your critique even exists, and if ignored, you'll simply fade away. My second idea: reduce the size and scope of government. America's tax code is now 4 times longer than the combined works of Shakespeare, 3.8 million words. I suggest to you that if Romeo and Juliet were alive today and tried to do a joint married tax return, they'd probably kill themselves again. Over 50 years ago, some lone voices forecast that if left unchecked, governments would become big brothers to us all. Today, the result of unchecked government power is that many of us now live in what may best be described as soft tyrannies. When the government takes half of everything you produce and regulates the smallest details of your daily life, it has become a master rather than a servant. The Nanny State project only succeeds politically because we continue to demand, condone, and excuse ever bigger, more expansive, more intrusive, and more coercive government. In truth, it's the government, not the taxpayer, that needs to go on a diet. Once you have a big welfare state in place, the excuse for state nannying is infinite in scale. An iron law of political physics is that a regulator will always find something new to justify his existence, whether or not he's needed. This continues the process of reducing self-reliance and handing responsibility for ourselves to external institutions. The Nanny State's strategic genius is also apparent in the introduction of lifestyle controls through the political and regulatory back door. For instance, through the passage of omnibus legislation, something that American nanny staters specialize in. In that American context, Obamacare is the clearest example. Very few people, especially congressmen, ever read the fine print. Many were surprised, even shocked, to learn that Obamacare mandated, among many other treasures, calorie counts on restaurant menus, a tax on indoor tanning, and financial penalties for smokers. In Richard Dawkins' latest book, he observes that the nanny state is intervening to protect us from ourselves, which he insightfully notes serves only to sap our initiative. Perhaps, if we were to apply the lessons of our opponent's playbook, while simultaneously campaigning to limit the size and scope of government, the forces of rationality, common sense, and evidence-based regulating would one day regain the political initiative. I'll end my formal remarks, if I may, with 2 diametrically opposed perspectives, both of them Marxist. Perspectives on personal choice, individual responsibility, and the role of government. There's the default nanny state position, which was presciently summed up by Groucho Marx when he declared, "Whatever it is, I'm against it. Then there's the opposite view, best summed up by Groucho's distant European relative, Karl. Karl Marx simply, yet so wisely, advised policymakers the following: question everything, ban nothing. I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but maybe that Karl Marx chap was really onto something. Thank you.